Well, welcome everyone to Education Commission of the States Partnering for Success. It is fantastic to see such a large and diverse group joining us today. Your participation truly enriches our discussion. We're thrilled to have you here, and a warm welcome to each of you, and thank you for joining our first webinar of 2025. My name is Tiffany McDole. I'm a policy director from Education Commission of the States, and I am excited to guide you through today's session. Today, we will be diving into a critical look at the past year's education policy changes and what might be coming in the year ahead. As a leader on our policy team, I'm especially proud to highlight our team members who will be sharing insights on topics ranging from early care and education to K-12 funding to post-secondary, offering valuable perspectives on how recent shifts in policy may impact students, families, and educators, as well as the overall system. We're thrilled to be able to bring you this content and to be your team at the forefront of tracking developments in education policy. Partnering for Success is designed to provide you with tools and resources that you can apply in your work, enhancing everyone's ability to address key challenges in state education policy. We're pleased to start off our webinar series this year with such an important discussion. So let's dive in to make today's time both valuable and impactful. We will start by meeting today's presenters. You will hear from 5 of our great team members at ECS today. Lauren Bloomquist will be covering post-secondary trends. Chris Duncombe will focus on K-12 finance. Adrienne Fischer focuses on issues in early learning, and she'll cover ECE today. Lauren Peisach will be covering both teaching and career and technical education trends today. And last, but of course not least, Zeke Perez Jr. will be covering our trends in health and student wellness. Thanks to each of you in advance for your insights and participation. Before we get to those trends, we wanted to briefly touch on the results of state elections in 2024. At ECS, we track elections to monitor their impact or potential impact on education policy. With new governors, new state legislators, and new education leaders across the country, we can anticipate some new priorities for students and families. You can read more in our election series on our blog, EdNote, but we'll chat here about some of the high-level results. 11 states held gubernatorial elections in 2024. During gubernatorial campaigns, Republican candidates tended to prioritize school choice, which was a central issue in at least 5 campaigns, by focusing on the expansion of charter schools and other school choice initiatives. Republican candidates also tended to stress the importance of parental involvement in education, local control, and school safety. On the other hand, Democratic candidates emphasized education funding and finance, which was a focal point of at least 6 candidates. They also tended to prioritize early childhood education and student support services. In addition to those gubernatorial elections, voters acted on 16 ballot measures across 14 states on education topics, ranging from funding to school choice and assessments. In the 4 states with elections for chief state school officers, 2 new partisan and 2 incumbent nonpartisan executives were elected. The state boards of education elections in 9 states and DC will also greatly impact education policymaking, especially as some of these boards either confirm or directly appoint their chief state school officer. Overall, this year's elections revealed diverse priorities among governors, governors-elects, and other education officials, but key issues like teacher retention, workforce development, early childhood education, and parental involvement took center stage. We're going to continue to track governors' priorities and education policy through our partnership with NGA on State of the State Address Tracking. Our website is live now, tracking governors' addresses across the country and their education priorities, and we hope that you'll take a look. With the elections context in mind, we're excited to share some of what we noticed about the national landscape and especially legislative trends in education policy. This presentation will start with the most prominent trends and will conclude with a few emerging or new trends that we're watching. We determine these trend areas through our analysis of state policy tracking and also information requests we receive directly from policymakers. At Education Commission of the States, we track policy for all 50 states and the District of Columbia and read and summarize every bill that is enacted or vetoed related to education. In 2024 alone, we tracked over 7,200 bills that were introduced in education policy. But we also answered over 400 unique information requests directly from policymakers about key policy issues. That gives us unique insight into what's on the mind of policymakers across the country. Without further ado, let's look into the top trends we witnessed last year. The top 6 trends are listed here and will be discussed in more detail. They are teaching in the educator workforce, K-12 funding, student health and wellness, post-secondary issues, early care and education, and career and technical education. We'll kick things off with talking more about the teaching trend, and for that, I turn it over to my colleague, Lauren.
Thanks, Tiffany. I'm Lauren Peisach, a policy analyst here at ECS, and I track and work on teaching issues. Teaching has long been a focus of state policymakers and continues to rank in the top 5 issues year over year, and for good reason. We know that teacher quality is one of the most important in-school factors influencing student achievement. Many of the challenges in the teaching profession are not new, so some of the responses may also feel familiar, along with the other innovations and changes we've seen in our approach. As legislators work to strengthen the teacher pipeline, we have seen policies that address the following components: paid pathways, holistic staffing, and certification and licensure. In paid pathways, this year, states expanded or created Grow Your Own programs, as well as teacher residency and apprenticeship programs to better prepare aspiring teachers. Many of these programs and initiatives are coming at no cost to help remove the financial burden of training to be a teacher. One emerging trend is state attention to stipends or other means of compensation for student teachers to ensure that completing clinical experience is not an undue financial burden to keep qualified future teachers in the profession. In holistic staffing, we've seen states work towards supporting future teachers through professional development in areas of concern for states like literacy. Additionally, states have shown attention to concerns around working conditions by supporting leave policies and increasing induction and mentoring programs. Another trend related to staffing is ensuring that teachers feel supported in staying in education fields by focusing attention to teacher compensation. In certification and licensure, we've seen a continuing trend from the past several years in that many states have been examining barriers to licensure that may pose entry to the profession, working to ensure that licensure requirements are meaningfully related to teacher quality. At least 2 states, Utah and Connecticut, are re-examining or removing their teacher performance assessment requirements for licensure. Many states created or revised licenses for specific teaching roles, such as CTE positions or special education teachers. Another area of movement that began in 2023 and continued this year around licensure reciprocity is the Teacher Mobility Compact, an interstate agreement allowing eligible teachers to transfer their license across state lines in participating states. Several other states continued legislation on this topic. And now for a couple of state examples. States look towards supporting teachers in specific areas through providing professional development. One area that was frequently highlighted for support last year was literacy. South Dakota allocated funds to support teachers for early literacy professional development. And another national trend is focusing on retention for special education teachers, including attention to the stressors and working conditions of teachers in those roles. This bill in West Virginia sets rules around student and teacher instructor ratios for self-contained and resource classrooms, as well as any special education environment, and provides a 2-week waiver to allow the hiring of a new teacher while the teacher who is already hired at the school gets additional pay for their additional work. And some other trends, we saw some states look to fill gaps in specific teaching roles by creating new pathways. These include programs like CTE, science, or special education roles. In Colorado, this program will allow candidates seeking to teach special education to earn a certification through alternative certification programs. States acknowledge the challenge that training and early teachers to the profession can face. Some supports that states have added to this area include induction and mentoring programs, and additionally, many states are exploring attention paid to paying student teachers, such as this UTEL program, the Stipends for Future Educators program. And now with that, I'll hand it over to Chris to chat with us about school finance.
Thank you, Lauren. My name is Chris Duncombe, and I lead ECS's work on K-12 finance. School finance is always a top-of-mind issue for state leaders, as it's one of the biggest discretionary spending items that they have in the state budget. Common state areas that we saw states take action in 2024 include making changes to their K-12 funding formula. Oftentimes in prior years, we see these changes are just minor tweaks to the existing formula, such as increasing the base per student amount to keep pace with inflation. However, this year, 2 states enacted major reforms to overhaul their funding formulas. And I'll go through each of those examples in a little bit more detail in a moment. States also made changes to supplemental funds allocated for certain student populations. In particular, we saw a lot of action around funding for special education and English learner services. As an example, Virginia adjusted their EL support. The state now differentiates the number of EL specialists that the state helps to fund in schools, and they do that based on the English proficiency of the student. The last trend that we saw was for teacher compensation. States have adopted new or increased existing minimum teacher salaries. They've also made across-the-board raises for teachers. An example that we saw this year was for South Dakota, and they enacted a minimum teacher salary of $45,000. They previously did not have a minimum teacher salary. They also will be adjusting that minimum amount by the Consumer Price Index going forward, capped at 3% growth. In addition to increasing their minimum teacher salary, they're also going to have average teacher salaries increase, keeping pace with inflation. Going into those 2 examples that I mentioned, it's not every year that a state adopts a new K-12 funding formula, so it's pretty exciting here in 2024 that 2 states overhauled their funding formulas. Colorado and Mississippi both enacted new formulas, and in both states they adopted a student-based model where funds are allocated on a per-student basis with additional weights for students with unique learning needs. Colorado's new formula, which has been years in the making, will begin in the 25-26 school year and will be phased in over 6 years. Some of the bigger changes to the formula include significant increases in the amount of aid allocated for students from low-income backgrounds and for English learners. Previously, Colorado had some of the lowest weights for EL students in the country, and with this new formula, that will no longer be the case. The EL weight has been increased from an additional 8% to 25%. The state has also added a new weight for special education services that is inside their formula, a locale factor for rural areas or towns, and broader application of their cost of living factor. To implement this new funding formula, the first year will cost the state an additional $92 million, and when it's fully phased in, it could cost the state up to $570 million. Colorado was not alone in adopting a new funding formula. Mississippi enacted the Mississippi Student Funding Formula that will take effect immediately without a phase-in period. Some of the larger changes that we saw in the MSFF include a shift in how students are counting for funding purposes from using attendance, which they did previously, towards enrollment, and this has been the trend in recent states. There was also a significant increase in funding for students from low-income families, and a new funding weight to support English learners and students in career and technical education classes. Prior to adopting this formula, Mississippi was one of just 2 states without supplemental funding for English learners. In the new formula, that fixes that issue, and the state now directs funds to support these services. The cost to the state to implement the new formula is estimated at roughly $220 million, and it also includes additional support for special education and rural districts, similar to Colorado. These 2 examples show that while it can be difficult and challenging to implement a new funding formula, states can overcome these barriers and replace their complex K-12 funding systems if they have the right leadership and community support in place. I'll now hand it off to Zeke to discuss student health.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate having you here. I'm Zeke Perez Jr., an assistant director on the policy team. I track our student health legislation, and so today I'll be discussing some key trends we've seen there over the last few years and that we expect to see in 2025. So overall, the trend we've seen state leaders take in the student health and wellness space is towards a more comprehensive view of physical and mental health. Research indicates that for many students, their first point of access to quality health services is in school settings. This physical health bucket might include actions like increasing the number of school health professionals, adjusting the services allowed to be administered at a school, and providing access to medications and other life-saving equipment. This may range from a small adjustment, like allowing school nurses to administer a certain medication, to larger efforts like establishing school health clinics. It also may include telehealth opportunities to better serve a broader population of students, including those from areas of need. Within physical health, another continuing trend is around nutrition and the provision of school meals to students, either during the school day or outside of school hours, including at after-school or summer school programs. Some states have also considered the expansion of school meals to a broader group of students, with more states proposing free universal school meals to all students. Next up, mental health and wellness are a critical part of students' overall health. And so we've seen a trend there from state leaders in additional legislation to support student mental and behavioral health. Student mental health and wellness are indicators of educational engagement and academic success, and so states have sought to expand access to mental health services and opportunities during school hours and at school sites. States have begun to introduce mental health literacy as part of the curriculum and have enacted staff training or professional development requirements around mental health, including awareness and training around identifying signs and symptoms of depression or mental illness in students. And states have also sought to increase other supports for students and staff in mental health. And finally, we've seen health become intertwined with other ed policy issues. So for example, as states are exploring chronic absenteeism, they have identified and approached underlying issues, including physical health, mental health, and school climate. Some states have expanded their definitions of excused absences to ensure that students can take mental health days as needed. So to look at some state examples in the space, Oklahoma's enacted legislation authorizes school nurses, diabetes care assistants, and other school staff to download the necessary software to their school or personal device in order to access student glucose data for any students who might be needing continuous glucose monitoring. And that example is indicative of a broader trend in state legislation around physical health, where we're seeing states begin to define and expand the allowable services that a school can provide. Next up, we'll look at nutrition. So back in 2023, a handful of states established universal free school meals, and more states considered similar programs in 2024. Right now, 8 states offer universal school meals, and Virginia is exploring joining that list with the passage of a working group that's tasked with exploring options and the impacts of offering free school meals. Last couple of state examples for you. Both the National Association of School Psychologists and the American School Counselors Association have issued recommended ratios of students to mental health professionals, but unfortunately, states and the national average are falling well short of those recommendations. Delaware's enacted legislation establishes a statewide mental health services unit for the state's high schools, and among other things, attempts to reach an improved ratio of psychologists and counselors to students with those national recommended targets, those national ratios as the target. And finally, Illinois has enacted legislation that requires teachers and other staff to be trained in a wide variety of student health and wellness topics to maintain their licensure. That list includes health conditions of students, social and emotional learning, identifying warning signs of mental illness and suicidal tendencies in students, and the ability to respond to abuse and violence. We've seen other states create training that's specific to roles in a school, so including legislation in Maryland, which requires that athletic coaches receive training in identifying warning signs in student athletes. So across the board, what we've seen in physical and mental health is state policymakers seeking to provide a more holistic array of services available to support student health, staff health, and student mental and physical wellness. And with that, I'll pass things to Lauren Bloomquist to discuss post-secondary issues.
Thanks, Zeke. Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Bloomquist. I'm a policy analyst covering post-secondary issues. The post-secondary space saw the most activity in affordability and finance. states continue to address high-demand workforce fields by offering financial aid and supportive pathways to individuals in specific high-demand fields, such as education and healthcare. Another noted trend is in admissions. Several states considered bills about various admission policies. In particular, some states proposed changes to direct or automatic admissions, and others examine the use of legacy admissions based on family relationships. And finally, we noted changes to post-secondary funding, specifically outcomes-based funding. We saw several states explore and create funding systems that incentivize outcomes. We saw a mix of bills that tried to address current policies and others creating new processes to distribute funds. Here are some state examples illustrating those post-secondary trends. In Washington State, the Washington Health Corps Behavioral Health Scholarship Program will support high-demand healthcare professionals in underserved communities. Wisconsin recently created the Wisconsin Guarantee Program, providing guaranteed admission to top-ranking high school students to the University of Wisconsin institutions. And finally, Pennsylvania established the Performance-Based Funding Council to develop a process to distribute funding to state universities. The process will use performance-based metrics meant to increase degree attainment, encourage affordability, meet workforce needs, and grow the economy. Next up, we have Adrienne to share early childhood education trends.
Thanks, Lauren, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adrienne Fischer, and I'm a senior policy analyst with ECS. And I'm now going to pivot us to the other end of the education continuum and share a few of the trending topics that we're seeing in early care and education, which we define as those learning and development opportunities that extend from birth all the way through the early elementary grades. The first trend I want to talk about is workforce and provider supports. As many of us know, the ECE infrastructure is still rebounding from the effects of the pandemic. And with that federal supplemental funding expiring, states are going to be stepping up to help sustain both the ECE workforce and the providers that employ them, the majority of which are small businesses owned and operated by women. Some of the policy levers that states are using include incentivizing workforce entry by improving compensation and creating better pathways for both the current and future ECE workforce, as well as supplementing financial stability for those providers through grants or subsidies, and supporting quality improvement, including physical space or facility improvements, and ensuring high quality programming and content. Many states have also been working to increase overall access that families have to early care and education programs and services across that mixed delivery system, from infant and toddler care all the way through 4- and 5-year-old pre-K. Several states have enacted policies expanding childcare tax credits or categorical eligibility for subsidies to members of certain professions, such as the ECE workforce or direct healthcare workers. Some states have also re-examined their subsidy reimbursement rates to better reflect the full cost of high-quality care. And some have been studying their state's unique context more holistically to identify some areas of improvement and efficiency, such as coordinated enrollment for social programs, including childcare. And finally, we continue to see momentum to change how early reading is taught, with many states enacting policies requiring early reading instruction to focus on evidence-based practices. Strategies include requiring districts to adopt high-quality instructional materials and assessment and intervention systems that are aligned with the science of reading, and developing guidelines to integrate those principles into the teacher preparation programs. We're also seeing more states extending these policies into the preschool space to develop those pre-literacy skills. We've also tracked at least 9 states that have enacted comprehensive legislation aimed to support early numeracy development, following a similar trajectory to the trends that we've seen in early literacy, including training and professional development, coaching, high-quality curricular materials, interventions, and more. So just to give a little context of how states are approaching these ECE policies, here's a few examples to illustrate those trends. In 2024, Iowa extended a pilot program expanding eligibility for childcare subsidies to the ECE workforce, joining several other states in supporting that workforce, as well as just expanding access generally for those families. And in Michigan, the TriShare childcare program, try saying that 5 times fast, helps defray the cost of childcare through an innovative equal cost sharing model between employers, families, and the state. The program began as a pilot in 2021 and was expanded in 2024. We've seen a couple of similar pilots in other states and some proposed legislation in a few other states as well. And finally, Louisiana was one of several states that enacted legislation last year related to numeracy skills in the early elementary grades. The bill requires foundational numeracy skills instruction and screening for grades kindergarten through 3rd, including a screener administered at the beginning of the school year, progress monitoring at mid-year, and targeted interventions for those students that are identified as having skills below grade level. It also requires textbooks and instructional materials to be high quality and research-based. We'll of course be tracking these and all the trending ECE topics throughout the year, so stay tuned. But next I'll pass it back to Lauren Peisach for an overview of our final trending topic.
Thanks, Adrienne. I'm back to talk about CTE and workforce trends. So with an eye towards educational and credential attainment, as a vehicle for economic mobility, states have increasingly focused on creating pathways in both secondary and post-secondary settings that provide students with opportunities to build knowledge and skills that support their preparation for future education and careers. So the first trend, student debt for high demand fields. As part of an ongoing trend, states enacted legislation that addresses student debt for those entering specific fields in occupation. The focus is often on high demand fields within the workforce at a state or regional level. The next trend, work-based learning pathways. Many states considered or passed legislation focused on supporting pathways that incorporate work-based learning with CTE and classroom learning in both a secondary and post-secondary setting. States also supported and implemented policies related to work-based learning that require partnerships across agencies and industry partners to support access to work-based learning and pathways to future education and careers. And the last trend, finally, funding CTE and workforce pathways. States have provided funds to support new and existing programs to increase CTE and career connected learning pathways. Often there's an emphasis on increasing participation and prioritizing funding for education and training in specific industries within states. Priorities are given to programs that will focus on industries that are identified as being or that will be in high demand. So on to some state examples. In Colorado, there was legislation passed that provides an example of work-based learning pathways that create alignment and partnerships and collaboration. The legislation aligns the state's high school CTE system with the registered apprenticeship system for programs and occupations related to infrastructure, advanced manufacturing, education, and healthcare. The law mandates that by July 2026, the state's apprenticeship agency and CTE division establish an advisory board that will align high school competencies with the CTE division and apprenticeship programs, as well as extend the number of aligned programs available, while also working with the program sponsors to brainstorm how to assign credit. The Office of Future Work is also responsible for the collaboration between state agencies, including post-secondary agencies, to facilitate awareness of this alignment. In Idaho, we have an example of how a state is providing funding for pathways that align local workforce demands. The legislation transfers $20 million to the Career Ready Students Program Fund, which will increase the capacity of CTE in Idaho middle and high schools by incentivizing districts to create programs that prepare students to meet local and regional industry and workforce standards. So finally, our last kind of trends to present to you, we have the bubble trends. So on the bubble, we've seen activity around the emergence of AI in school settings, post-secondary affordability, and school choice. Technology and how it affects a student's ability to learn in schools has been a common trend for years, but with emerging technology developing more and the emergence of AI in school settings, it's States have been monitoring these trends closely and continue to discuss the possible health implications that it may have on students in their social and emotional learning. We've also seen a recent uptick in states banning cell phones in schools. Next, states have continued to invest in grant initiatives and programs that can make post-secondary options affordable and accessible to all student populations. And lastly, school choice continues to float as a consistent trend in the education space. States continue to explore ways and expand opportunities for parents to choose the best school option for their student, regardless of their zip code. And now I'll hand it back to Tiffany, who's going to facilitate a Q&A.
Great. Thank you. And thanks everyone for your contributions on those trends. I welcome our audience to enter your questions into the question function so that we can direct them to our panelists. We have some that have been entered already, so we'll begin with those. The first is about school finance. So Chris, I'll welcome your contributions here. The question is about declining school enrollment. How are you seeing states respond? What are you keeping an eye on for the year ahead?
Thanks, Tiffany. This is an area that has a lot of interest right now, as there's been significant changes to enrollment in recent years after decades of enrollment growth that school districts have experienced. During the pandemic, there was the immediate drop that happened of almost 3%, and then enrollment did not rebound at the levels that many had anticipated. Going forward, many states and districts are looking at the potential for fewer students in their school buildings. NCES projections, that's the National Center for Education Statistics, has projected that 40 of 50 states will have fewer students in them in 2031 than they do now. Some of the common responses that we've seen so far on the policy front, there was the initial response during the pandemic of enacting a temporary hold harmless policy. This is where the state guarantees that districts will receive prior year funding levels, even if they saw a downturn in the number of students in their schools. Many of those policies that were in place were for 2 to 4 years and haven't expired or in the process of expiring. And now districts or states are looking at alternative approaches for helping states transition to the new number of students in their buildings. The other two approaches that we've seen have been a transition to blended counts for students. So rather than providing the allotment for districts based on a 1-year count, having 3 to 5 years average being the amount of aid that goes to districts. This continues to factor in present enrollment, but it also dilutes it a little bit so there's not an immediate cliff impact for drops in enrollment, and districts experience those declines a little bit more gradually. Another approach that we've seen is states to set up enrollment stabilization funds. Florida is an example of a state that did that in 2024 when they created the Florida Education Enrollment and Stabilization Program, and they appropriated $350 million to that. And that is aid that is allocated districts that are seeing fluctuating enrollment so that they can provide a stability of operation. So having a dedicated non-reverting fund that can be allocated to support districts that are experiencing declines is that last approach we saw. So
Great.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, Chris, thank you so much for the detailed response. While you've got the mic, I'm going to pivot next to a school choice question, actually, to address something that someone included in their question. When we said on the bubble trends, what we meant to say is they weren't the most prominent. Those on the bubble trends were emerging, maybe something new that we saw more activity in last year than we had in previous years, but they didn't rise to the top in terms of the volume of legislation or the extent of legislation we saw. But the question regarding school choice is if at ECS we are tracking private school choice expansions and particularly corresponding appropriations. So Chris, I'll let you start.
Yes, and we have a 50-state summary on private school choice policies, and we track that every year. We saw in 2024 the continued trend of expanded use of educational savings accounts and transitioning towards universal ESAs. with Alabama enacting a universal ESA program to join the other states that have done that recently. We also saw states that are in the process of, and this isn't a legislative trend, but more on the implementation side, states that are in the process of implementing their universal ESAs to run into budgetary challenges with difficulties of projecting what the participation will be. In particular, Arizona ran into some budgetary challenges where enrollment was higher than what they had initially budgeted for. In the first year of their universal program of implementation, the total participation actually grew by over 400%. So it was a substantial increase in participation in the program. And I think as more states transition to universal ESA programs, maybe it'll become a little bit easier to project what those enrollment will be. But that is definitely an issue that many of the states that have started with the universal programs experienced initially.
Thank you, Chris. And for anyone looking to follow developments in the school choice field, you're welcome to follow up with us after the webinar, or as Chris mentioned, check out our resources, including that 50-state comparison. We have a couple of questions related to teachers. So Lauren, I'll come to you with this. To start off, one question is about efforts to increase diversity of the teacher workforce. What are you tracking and seeing in that space?
So I know that, or I should say, we know that teacher diversity is important to having a robust teacher workforce, and recruitment and retention has long been a focus of legislators as they try and make sure that they're both recruiting a strong class of new educators and retaining the great educators that they already have. One example that comes to mind was last year, Minnesota passed an Aspiring Teachers of Color Scholarship Pilot Program that is working toward recruiting teachers of color into the classroom, and specifically trying to recruit that group to increase the numbers of diverse teachers in their workforce.
Great, thanks, Lauren. I think as we've seen more states implement programs like apprenticeships as well, we have heard from policymakers that in the implementation of those programs, they're interested in increasing the diversity of the workforce through those various mechanisms. So we are seeing teacher diversity crop up in so many spaces. Lauren, continuing on the theme of teachers, we also have a question related to state licensure exams for teacher candidates. Is that one of the barriers to entering the profession that state policymakers are wrestling with? And what trends are you seeing around state licensure exams?
I think the bigger trend that I've seen within state licensure is creating new pathways into the profession through licensures, particularly with alternative certification licenses. Creating more pathways. We have seen some states address what types of licensure exams that have that are required in order to attain licenses. But I would say in terms of the volume of approach, the bigger focus has been in increasing the number of pathways and avenues that teaching candidates can pursue in order to get into the profession. I don't know, Tiffany also works on teaching issues. If something comes to mind specifically around the exams, but what comes to mind for me in terms of the volume when I see in the tracking the teacher space, the conversation has been really focused on the number of new pathways to allow teachers to enter the space.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. I think that is my observation as well. I would say I think we're in an interesting moment in terms of the teaching profession, and particularly licensure exams and requirements, where on the one hand, we have this increase in pathways into the profession that often don't require a licensure exam, or you can take the exam after you're already teaching, as long as you pass within a year or some set amount of time. On the other hand, many states are enacting new licensure exams, particularly around that expansion of attention to early numeracy and literacy that Adrienne elevated. So there are several states that in the past several years have added a new licensure exam around the science of reading. So you sometimes within the same state, those two things are happening. A new licensure exam that targets specific skills or specific knowledge while also expanding pathways that may not require that very same licensure exam. So we're seeing policymaking sometimes in the same state on both sides of the coin. We also received a question about teacher evaluation and if there are any signs that more attention might go that direction to focus on teacher evaluation. What I would signal is as pandemic era waivers expire that often removed the requirement or delayed the requirement for evaluation, several states have been wrestling with what they want to keep long-term in their teacher evaluation and principal evaluation systems. New Jersey, New York have moved on this issue recently. Some states have initiated task forces or are re-examining the inclusion of student growth within their models. So Lauren and I are both keeping a very close eye on teacher evaluation. Within that same question, there was a second component, and Lauren Bloomquist, I'll come to you on this one. Even though it's not about post-secondary, I'm going to tap into your knowledge about school accountability and school improvement. The question is, any trends in state efforts to identify low-performing schools and have associated either consequences for low performance or to address school quality? So in other words, what are you seeing in trends in state accountability systems?
I think we continue to see states kind of look at assessment and how that's pushing accountability and looking at different ways of assessing students and how we can create assessment systems that do get at the crux of accountability. So how can these assessments actually highlight how schools are performing? One of the things that we've also seen is since the break in the pandemic, a lot of states did take that pause. And I think we are starting to see that the results from that pause. So those states that took off time for those schools or those districts that have been identified, they're now kind of coming back up now that we've started our assessment and accountability systems kind of in full force again.
Great, Lauren, thank you so much. And please keep the questions coming if there are other things on your mind. The next, I'll field myself, but I'll let Adrienne join me in thinking actually about technology. As you can tell, folks explore a variety of issues. We don't only wear one hat here at ECS. The question is, any state that is particularly leading in AI issues? I don't know off the top of my head that any one state is really out in front on this, but I did want to signal that SRAB has a very active task force on AI in education. And if you are curious to learn more, we often point towards their resources. But Adrienne, is there a state that comes to mind for you, or even just some leading policies across states when it comes to AI?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one to answer just because we don't really know what that looks like yet, of what sort of those best practices are. There are some states that have explored a couple of different both curriculum options and professional development. I know Georgia had a pilot program. I think it was for middle school students that was a course on understanding and applying artificial intelligence, and I believe it also had a professional development component to it as well. Many states have created task forces or working groups to really kind of explore what kinds of applications they want for education in their schools and in their state. So I think we are still kind of at that tip of the iceberg moment where there's just not a whole lot that's happening on the state policy level. I know we've all heard anecdotally that there's a lot happening on the district and school level of classrooms trying to figure out how to integrate that into their learning for students and helping students. But I think other than many states having issued guidance, I think about somewhere around 20 states. Tiffany mentioned the SREB database tracks those guidances very closely, but about 20 states have issued guidance of some sort to try and help those districts and schools and teachers really figure out how to integrate those things into their classrooms.
Yeah, Adrienne, thank you. As a point of evidence of how quickly things are changing in this field, I believe in March of last year, only 8 states had issued guidance related to AI use in education, and now we're above 20 to 25. So this is clearly an issue that states are paying attention to. We also know that a variety of task forces concluded at the end of the calendar year, and those recommendations might be elements we see in legislative sessions this year. Switching topics, Zeke, will tap into your knowledge about STEAM. Any insights on programs for K-8 STEM or STEAM education? Have you seen resources, training, programs? What are we seeing in that space? And of course, Adrienne, you're welcome to join in from the early learning perspective as well.
Yeah, I'd say all of the above to the things you mentioned. In our conversations with states and in our tracking, we know that states are still sharpening their STEAM definitions and working to ensure that the arts are integrated nicely with existing STEM ecosystems and integrating arts lessons with math lessons, other lessons. So from the definition standpoint, that's one area we've seen it. We've also seen states work to provide additional professional development for their staff, additional curriculum in STEAM for their students. So yeah, to answer your question, I think a little bit of everything across states in STEAM.
Thank you, Zeke. All right, a couple of questions coming in related to summer learning, extended learning, after-school programming. Of course, we know this was a big priority with rounds of ESSER funding. So the question is, are states continuing those programs as that federal funding subsets, or what other trends have we seen in the space of summer program and enrichment? I can start, and then anyone else on the team that'd like to answer, please jump in. In the world of sort of seeing two potentially contradictory trends at the same time, we are tracking a number of states that are looking at either expanding the school day or expanding the school year, whether that's through within school programs or after school partnerships, summer school partnerships. At the same time, we are also monitoring a growing trend towards 4-day school weeks across the country, though there are a handful of states that are starting to put more guardrails in place for districts that are interested in moving on the 4-day school week. I don't mean to say those are inherently contradictory. It's just interesting that we're seeing sort of a contraction of the school day, or what we think of as in-school time. At the same time, we're also seeing expansions of the school day or the school year of what we think of as in-school time. So we're actually seeing growth in both of those areas. Oregon in the past year made a major investment ongoing in summer learning and expanded year opportunities. We've also tracked efforts in California. So yes, there are a number of states that are looking at long-term funding for after-school, longer school year programming. Chris, Adrienne, I know you've worked on this issue a bit. Any other contributions related to that question?
The only other example I would mention, and it's been around for a while and has sort of developed over the years, would be New Mexico, because they have kind of added that aspect to as an optional add-on for schools that want to opt into their, I think it's at this point K-12 plus. It started off as K-5 plus, and I think expanded to maybe K-8. It may be K-12 at this point. Chris probably knows. But allowing states to have that flexibility to add on additional learning time after school and over the summer. I know that had kind of a slow ramp up when it was first implemented, but that was many years ago. I think 7 or 8 years ago was when it was first implemented. So I think we maybe will see more states kind of looking for ways to look at adding on some of that extra learning time.
I'll just reiterate what Adrienne said, and yes, it is the K-12 plus program in New Mexico, and they've integrated that into their primary funding formula. So districts that opt in get additional funding per student that's participating at, and it's not a separate grant program outside of their main funding formula.
Great, thanks for that level of detail. And I want to be sure to mention that the states we mentioned off the top of our head are not an exhaustive list. So if you're looking for a full accounting of what's going on in the extended school year or summer learning space, let us know. We're also tracking efforts in Texas and many other places. Next up, we have a question here about civics, both civics opportunities for students and civics standards, civics curriculum. Adrienne, I know you've tracked curriculum. What have you seen in the civics space?
Yeah, there was definitely legislation last year in several states to either add into the curriculum a requirement for a class or a credit in either civics, or sometimes it's interchangeable with a course on American government. Different states treat it differently, but also several states have created a civics seal or a particular designation that you can have for your diploma if you complete a certain amount of coursework. It often involves some volunteer work as well. Those are the things that come to mind just from the past year.
Great, thank you so much. We have time for one more question here, and Adrienne, you get the pleasure of closing us out. On ECE trends, are more states beginning to consolidate their early childhood services into one governance structure? And if so, what challenges are they experiencing, either administratively or politically?
That is a great question. And as it happens, we just published our update to our 50-state comparison on early care and education governance in the fall. And the last time that we had done that data collection was 2020. And in that 4-year period, we saw 9 states that made major changes to their governance structures. And that included both consolidation and the creation of a new agency dedicated to ECE. Now, with that caveat, even when states consolidate, it's rare for every single one of their early care and education components and programs to be in a single agency. Even those with consolidated structures tend to have that spread out over at least a couple or different agencies requiring that level of coordination. In terms of some of the lessons learned and issues that come up for some of these consolidated structures, some of them are so new and some of them are still in the process of being implemented, these new structures, that it's hard to answer that question. I think just anecdotally from what we've heard from states that have done it relatively recently, like New Mexico or Colorado, which both created new agencies, the message was always communication and coordination was key, was making sure that those lines of communication across those agencies and those programs that were being consolidated to really understand what those different staff were bringing to the table from those different agencies and those different cultures and combining them. And that it's just a process that happens over time. I think in some states, they've done this quite quickly over a shorter period of time. And some states, they've had a slower ramp up for implementation. And I think sort of, and again, anecdotally, that sort of longer ramp up to give yourself a little bit of grace period, I think has been received well from those states that had the ability to do that.
Great. Thank you, Adrienne. And thank you all for all of those great questions and for your participation today. We really appreciate each of you joining us. And I hope that you'll join me in a virtual round of applause for our wonderful presenters. Thank you to each of you. Please remember as you go forward that Education Commission of the States is here to support you in your work. Looking ahead to 2025, there are many projects and events that are in the works, and we want to highlight a couple of those. Our next Partnering for Success is focused on trends in Governor's State of the State addresses and will be on March 19th. We also hope you'll save the date for our National Forum on Education Policy, July 9th through 11th at the Grand America Hotel in Salt Lake City. We'll be celebrating our 60th anniversary, so please come and join us for the party. Registration will open in April. We are also hosting 2 invite-only policy academies in March, one focused on STEAM. So thank you for the question on STEAM earlier today, and the other about higher education and prisons. If you're interested in learning more about these convenings, we hope you'll contact Antoinette Garcia, and we'll add her contact information in the chat. We've also released many new resources to support your work. We'll show a sampling of them here. But please also browse our website and be in touch if there's something you cannot find related to the topics we discussed today. We are pleased to bring each of you together through our Partnering for Success webinar to help provide solutions to some of today's most pressing challenges in education policy. We could not be so successful without the support of our partners. Each of the partners listed here has a commitment to collaboration and innovation to pave the way for meaningful improvement in education. So to each partner, we thank you and acknowledge your tremendous support. We trust that you are going to take away at least one idea from today's session that your state can draw from or build upon. If you have questions related to today's session, please reach out to me personally, including if you had a question in the chat that we either didn't fully answer or didn't have the time to answer. And today's recorded session will be shared in your post-event email. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. We are adjourned.